Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us for today's webinar with Rachael Cristine Woody. My name is Bradley, and I will be your moderator for this webinar titled Accessibility Standards for Museum Collections Online. Before we start, I would like to provide some information about our company and introduce today's presenter. Lucidea is a software developing company specialized in museum and archival collections management solutions, as well as knowledge management and library automation systems. Our brands include Sydney, Presto, Argus, Archivera, Eloquent, and Quadrastar. Now I would like to take a moment to introduce today's presenter, Rachael Cristine Woody. Rachael is the owner of Relicura and provides services to museums, libraries, and archives. She specializes in museum collections management systems, digitization technology, digital project management, and digital usership. During the course of her career, she has successfully launched multiple digital projects that include advanced digitization technology, collaborative portals, and the migration of collection information into collections management systems. She is also a popular guest author for Lucidea's Think Clearly blog and has provided us with many great webinars that are listed on our website, so please feel free to check those out after today's session. Take it away, Rachael.
Thank you so much, Bradley, and to Lucidea for hosting us today. And thank you, everybody, for joining us on this webinar. We're going to cover quite a bit today, and it goes over some great accessibility standards and resources. So as I walk you through each of these, there are citations and resource slides at the end of this slide deck where you can go and learn more and check out more resources available regarding accessibility. But for today, we're going to do sort of a accessibility 101. And while these standards are standards that are applied to pretty much anything that is website or mobile on your smartphone, we are going to cover them through the lens of a museum collections management system. And as that system presents your collection online to your public audience. So it's accessibility content that can apply to very broadly to everything, but we're going to make sure that we bring in how this could apply or impact in a good way the way your collections are presented online. With that said, we're going to cover just like an intro on the American with Disabilities Act, ADA, the disability as defined by the ADA, so we're all working with a similar definition. We'll then talk about what does accessibility mean? What is that definition? And what are the standards that have been established? While these standards are currently ones that are being followed for United States organizations, I will emphasize here that the accessibility standards and resource is one that is an international standard. So whether you're in Canada or abroad, anywhere else, it's an international standard that can be referenced for your organizations as well, not just those in the United States. And then how the accessibility principles come into play. There are 4 different divisions of the accessibility principles where we can review the different requirements, which can be a helpful way to break down these somewhat large and robust areas of standards for us to consider. And then, as I mentioned, we'll go over some of those resources and citations where you can go and learn more. All right, so the American with Disabilities Act, or ADA, prohibits the discrimination on the basis of disability. And disability, that discrimination occurring in employment, the state and local government services that they offer, access to those services, public accommodations, so anywhere in the public that needs to be accessible in many different ways and regards, to commercial facilities, transportation, and telecommunications. So these are different areas where having accessibility in the various flavor of ways that each of us humans needs it is not only required, but is part of the standard. Disability itself, when we're talking about it as defined by the ADA, is a person, past or present, who is perceived to have either a physical and or mental impairment that substantially limits the major life activities for that individual's life. And in terms of an accessibility definition, and one that we should keep in mind as we cover these various aspects, is when the needs of people with disabilities are specifically considered when creating products, services, and facilities. So in our case, the Museum Collections Management System as available online to the public. And the principles of accessibility, the four principles we'll go over, help to ensure people of all abilities can interact with the information and services in an equal and inclusive way. So again, thinking about your museum collections online, how can you facilitate a way for anyone with any ability to be able to access your collections, interact with it, and engage in that collection and your services in an equal way? So having that in mind as we go through these requirements. So how does accessibility relate to collections online specifically? We want to make sure we're thinking about as we apply accessibility, it's not just a benefit for those who may be in the disabled community. It increases collections access to all online constituents. So any sort of improvement in accessibility and the user interactions with your collection is going to benefit your entire audience, not just a subset. It helps to improve that user experience. So as we go through and make different changes, whether on a technical or in a design or display decision sort of way, we also help to improve that user experience. It also helps to fulfill funder requirements, which is an important thing to keep in mind, especially if you're going for any sort of municipal funding. So city, state, province, federal level funding will typically have inherent to that program accessibility requirements for whatever product or wherever the money is being invested to. Also, and as an added improvement in discoverability of your collections, it helps to support search engine indexing with some of these improvements in like the framework and the additional data that would be included. And that overall helps to increase the discoverability of your collections through things like doing a Google search. So, accessibility standards, and again, this particular subset starts with a United States standard, but does reference that international standard. And as recently as April 2024, in the United States, the Department of Justice Civil Rights Division published a final rule for Title II and underneath the American with Disabilities Act, so underneath the ADA. And then using and referencing the World Wide Web Consortium, or more commonly known W3C, and its Web Accessibility Initiative, which has created the standards we'll reference in this presentation, the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, so WCAG or WCAG. There are a few different ways I've heard their particular acronym pronounced. And Title II of that ADA final ruling references WCAG and the specific version of their standards being 2.1 level AA. And there's some different flavors of the level of standards, but the ones that are specifically called out from the DOJ final ruling is the version 2.1 and specifically level AA versus just level A or a AAA level. So those are the ones important to keep in mind, especially for the United States organizations, but it's also an excellent version for any other organization internationally to consider as you take a look at accessibility. All right, so we're going to dive in, and the four principles that sort of house the different facets of accessibility are perceivable. Is it something that we can perceive? In this case, information, context, relationships of collections online. Is it operable? Is it something that can operate, whether it's through a mouse click or like pointer assistive technology or through keyboard entry? Is it understandable? And this gets into both like technical framework, but also in how information is presented, created, how context is displayed, thinking of things to help make that information for collections online easy and understandable. And is it robust? And in many ways, this is thinking about what is the long-term robustness of the decisions we make now to support accessibility. And as technologies change, including our collections management system, as well as the assistive technologies, is our, in this case, collections online robust enough to roll and be acceptable and still operable with those changes? There are a couple of words we're going to use that may not be immediately obvious or in your vocabulary just yet. The first one is assistive technologies. And what that means is any of the sort of tools that someone with a disability may use to help them interact with and access your collections online. So, for example, a screen reader for someone who is low vision or blind, they may use a screen reader to help them navigate and interact with your collections online. Another phrase we're going to use as we discuss these things is programmatically interpret or programmatically determine. And what that means is that essentially it's not the human as the first person to interpret whatever is being displayed on the screen, for example. It is some sort of program, whether it's a computer or an assistive technology, that can help interpret and then produce whatever output that person needs in order to understand, interpret, and navigate your collections online. All right, so getting into perceivable, which is principle number one, this is one of the bigger areas of accessibility guidelines that we should think about. And it's specifically when we think about online collections content, the interface needs to be presented to users in a way where the assistive technology can help them perceive things. So perceiving can be visual, it can be audible in terms of how we are taking in information. In terms of requirements, there are quite a few, and so I'll go through each one and define it for you and then provide where immediately obvious where collections online can connect. However, as we go through these different principles, I definitely recommend that you check out the WCAG online resources, which we'll share at the end of this presentation, as they go into much more depth and also offer a suite of resources, informational webinars, etc., where you can learn more. So as we think through perceivable, one of the first items is thinking about text alternatives. So while collections online can be very text heavy, not everything is text. So we want to make sure that we're providing text alternatives whenever there is no text content. And when we're thinking about collections online, we want to think about the specific non-text assets. So images is a big obvious one where we can provide like alternative text with that asset. So someone who is trying to perceive that asset but cannot visually, that perhaps there's that textual description where they can intake that information. The next big one is the time-based media. So separate from images, we're thinking about like audiovisual materials. And so when something is being presented in that visual sense, especially, we want to make sure that there's descriptive text that goes with that that helps to explain what is being presented in non-text. So in like a visual artwork installation or perhaps like a visual oral history interview that is happening. And so specifically thinking about including captions, audio descriptions with that kind of material. So for that collections online, this is really thinking about your assets specifically. Then as we move through how to help perceive information and relationships, and this can be big for collections online as many of our collections do have relationships and information that does dovetail with one another. So when we're thinking about the object information, information of the structure of how things are presented, an object's relationship with another object, or perhaps additional website content or resources that you would like to link through, we need to make sure that that relationship, the information of that, is presented in a way that could be programmatically determined or available in text form. So again, remembering our definition of programmatically determined, meaning that essentially a non-human tool can help gather that information and interpret it in a perceivable way for that user. Next up, meaningful sequence. So specifically how things are presented. For objects and information, we want to make sure that if there's some sort of intention to how they are presented, for example, like a digital exhibition, that the sequence can be correctly determined by a program. So again, for someone, there's not a human first interpretation, a program is helping to interpret and then produce that information to someone in a perceivable way. Next up, sensory characteristics. And so this is the presentation of the collections online specifically, and thinking about navigation. And we need to not solely rely on sensory characteristics, which are defined as colors, shape, size, visual location, orientation, or sound. For collections, especially with traditional collections management systems, those that are proprietary, they're usually very good at, if there is shape and color involved, which is common, that there's also text or some sort of explanation of what particular tab, link, or navigation tool is going to send you to next. And then thinking about orientation. So this one is quite literally orientation of how things are being presented on whatever screen someone is using, and that it isn't restricted to one specific display orientation. So it needs to be somewhat adaptable for that particular user, especially if there's a different orientation of the screen needed for their needs or their interpretive tools. And then, of course, identify input purpose. This one gets into a bit more of the technical. It's the ability of the user to correctly interpret the purpose of input. And when we're thinking about collections online, that is specifically thinking about, like, if there's an advanced search, there are several areas where a user may wish to input particular search criteria, and they need to, with either their assistive technologies or whatever perceivable tools they may be using, the ability to know what those input fields are, where they are, and what they can input in there in order to engage in those input areas with a correct and expected result. And then as we get into the more visual, we want to think about use of color. And there's some great tools out there where you can compare like your specific brand or logo colors to make sure that like your contrast ratio is correct. But first and foremost, use of color. The colors presented by the collections management system specifically can't be just like the only indicator or visual method of communicating that information and directing action or soliciting a response. So again, thinking about, we need to make this perceivable in more than just a visual sense, and in this case, color. For audio control, if especially you have audio assets, so perhaps audio only oral history interview, for an example, that it's presented online by the collections management system, and it has a mechanism to pause or stop the media with an ability to control the volume. And that's perceivable in more than just one way. So whatever that particular assistive technology is needs to be able to control the presentation of that audio, and in particular, if it's in like an autoplay. Then contrast. There's a contrast minimum and ratio to keep in mind when we're thinking about the use of text and images, specifically as they're presented with your collections management system online. And it's a 4:5:1 ratio, and there's some noted exceptions. So this is one area where I definitely recommend you go to the WCAG resources and guidelines area to learn what those exceptions are, and also how you can determine the appropriate ratios to meet that threshold and perhaps exceed it. The next thing we want to think about is resized text. So navigation text, specifically object data in your collections online, to make sure that it is reactive and can be resizable in the way it's being displayed. And this particular requirement is specifically not with assistive technology, it's with that browser resizing. And with your particular browser, whichever one you're using, it should be able to resize up to 200% while maintaining the CMS public portal navigation and functionality. So we should be able to zoom in essentially 200% and have the collections online, complete with navigation and everything, be correctly presented and still be functional at that particular size. Similarly, images of text. So when we're thinking about real text as opposed to images of text, it should be used at all times when we're thinking about navigation. So navigation specific should be text only, or definitely text, even if there's some visual. And if there is images that have text within it, having some sort of alt text attached to it, because if it's just an image with text in it, it cannot necessarily be accurately interpreted and communicated to the person who's accessing it with any sort of assistive technology. Reflow. So this is one of the ones where it's like, what the heck does that mean? So reflow is collections online content and presented in a way without requiring scrolling in 2 dimensions. So we're used to scrolling usually in 1 dimension, top to bottom, or depending on your mouse, bottom to top, and making sure that there's no like left to right or right to left scrolling required. So usually the more traditional top to bottom, for example, and no of the two dimensions in order to see the full information and functionality available. For non-text contrast, so this is thinking about colors used on the website, and there's a specific contrast ratio when we're thinking about colors. That particular one is a 3-to-1 ratio. And you may wonder, how the heck do I know that with my colors? There are some great tools for that color contrast that you can access for free. So it's definitely something that you can check out and play with. And similarly, text spacing. So we're thinking about ratios, presentation of text and images. Similarly with text spacing, there is different line heights to consider to make things more easily readable, letter spacing and word spacing specifically. So there are some very specific ratios that you can check out in the WCAG guidelines to ensure that your particular spacing meets those minimum thresholds. And then content on hover or focus. So hover and focus is typically when you take your mouse and you hover over a particular element, whether that is an image or some text, and it helps to, like, maybe there's like a pop-up window or some additional text that shows up as you do that. That particular capability should be dismissible as well as persistent if hover and focus is removed. So there needs to be a way programmatically for the assistive technologies to be able to interpret those specific sort of functionalities that happen that otherwise wouldn't be interpretable or perceivable by that person. So this is not something very typical for us to see in a collections online presentation, but yet can show up. So we want to make sure we're paying attention to those and that they are perceivable, not just with regular like human eye, but by any sort of assistive technology as well. All right, so that was principle 1. Principle 2 is perhaps the next largest, and that's because it's all about being operable. And specifically, how do we operate, in this case, collections online, and that's navigation, that's engagement and use of the museum collections. So it's another big category, but one that's pretty important for the type of work that we're presenting. So thinking about operable now, several of these are specific to keyboard inputs. So again, making sure there's some multiple ways where we're importing, as well as making sure there's not like pitfalls of using different technologies that have not been supported appropriately. So diving into the keyboard stuff first, when we're thinking about keyboard, we need to make sure that the navigation through the collections online can be supported by keyboard input versus like mouse input in any of the navigation directions. And any functionality such as selection of object records, selecting digital assets to play or enlarge, and any sort of search, selection, and functionality must be available using a keyboard in addition to point click or what have you. So multiple ways to operate within the collections online. Similarly, we need to make sure then that there's no keyboard trap. And this is what happens when someone perhaps is using a keyboard to help move and navigate into an element of our collections online interface. For example, maybe they've clicked on an image to help zoom in and enlarge, or in this case, not clicked, use their keyboard to access the image and enlarge. And it must also be possible then for them to navigate out of that. So again, keyboard input, being able to navigate out of that enlarged image area without getting trapped because there's not a keyboard input where they can't navigate out. So that's what the keyboard trap means in terms of if they get into something through a keyboard input, they need to be able to get out of something with keyboard input. And then thinking about character key shortcuts. So if the collections online interface for some sort of element does allow a keyboard shortcut, then it must be possible to either turn it off or be able to remap it to a different keyboard input. This is especially important if people are using keyboards to help navigate the website. Something they may be using on the keyboard could be considered a shortcut, in which case there's a conflict of being able to operate within your collections online. And that particular shortcut is only active when the component or element is in focus. So also limiting the ability of the shortcut to where it is appropriate. All right, and then shifting into timing here for operations. First up is timing adjustable. And so this is if there's any sort of time limit related to searching or viewing a collections online, it has to be possible for the user to then turn off that time limit, adjust it, or extend it. This isn't typical for collections online as presented to the public. However, this may be something to consider for your own staff needs when they are operating within the collections management system on the back end, where having something like log off timing limits can happen and perhaps need to be adjusted for accessibility reasons. Next up is pause, stop, or hide. So for any sort of moving visual assets as part of the museum collection's content being presented, especially if there's the autoplay feature, we need to make sure that there's some sort of mechanism that can be operable to help stop or pause that particular asset in this case. We specifically want to be mindful of those that experience seizures or any sort of physical reaction that can be provoked by, in our case, usually digital assets being played or presented, especially the time-based, the moving visuals. And there is specifically a 3 flashes or below threshold. And specifically for this particular rule, it is 3 flashes that occur within 1 second. So if there is some flashing, that it can be okay for that asset, but it is very specific in terms of 3 flashes within 1 second is too many flashes and is dangerous for some of your community users. And then as we think about operation and navigating, thinking about bypass blocks, what this particular one means, and as we think about collections online, that online portal, it can pertain to like that repetitive information. So sometimes for us, that can be footer of how to request materials that can pop up with every sort of view of the record. It can be any sort of information in the footer of the overall website that can be repeatable. So depending on whatever sort of programmatic or assistive technologies our particular users are using as their tool, that there's a way for them to get past that repetitive information, especially if they're using a tool where that seems to pop up pretty consistently. And then page titled. So for each of the website areas, and again, usually if you're with a proprietary collections management system, usually things are very well labeled and laid out. Even so, we want to make sure that each area of that collections online website is delineated and clearly titled and with labels that make sense. So things that make the purpose or topic of that page very obvious. And so in our case, at a minimum, that's typically the like the welcome or the home page. That's the like advanced search page. If that is in a different type of tab within that collections management system, you may have a separate like reference request page, etc. So making sure that those areas, those landing pages within your collections online are very clearly and obviously labeled. All right, and continuing our operations, thinking about that focus order, and focus is going to come up a couple more times before we end, so it's a good one to tune into specifically. And for collections online pages that have to be navigated in a certain order, so for example, maybe like a digital exhibition, there must be an ability to help focus on each component in the correct order. So it needs to be operable in more than one way, and especially more, not just the typical like point or click or whatever that default presentation is. And we need to be able to go through like results pages, hierarchical faceted searching, those digital exhibits, anywhere where information is presented in that specific way, that it's being displayed where the meaning is conveyed for each of those delineations as you move through. So making sure that we're able to interpret as users in a few different ways what sort of focus order we're supposed to go through. Next up for link purpose in context. So link purpose is fairly obvious in terms of also like having our pages obviously titled. We want to make sure that our links are obviously titled with whatever purpose or wherever they are sending you to. So when we're thinking about collections content specifically, we most often link to either other items or like a rights and reproductions area or statement. And so each of those links, if you're sending someone somewhere else, needs to have some sort of obvious title within that hyperlink so that as a human navigates through it, they know exactly where they're being sent to. So this is just one of the many obvious areas where this is not only helpful for our disabled community members, it can be incredibly helpful for any of your users who's not sure what sort of link they may be clicking on. Next up, the multiple ways. So thinking about main areas of the collections online, there should be multiple pathways present for someone to navigate through. This is just good like user presentation in general. So it's another excellent universal standard to sort of apply and improve everyone's experience. And thinking about, for example, specifically object records, display a result of specific steps where they can move to different areas, or if there's exceptions, what the sort of behavior is so that everybody knows what to expect as they're sort of navigating through these pathways. What can help with that is our next requirement, the heading and labels. So the web page titles, the headings, we wanted to make sure that those were obvious. Similar within those different landing pages, making sure each of the areas of those different landing pages have labels of their particular sections that are obvious. So we just want to make sure, again, it's just good user navigation, but also makes and improves the accessibility of this type of content where we know what sort of information we're seeing in each of these sections. And then to have focus visible. So where keyboard operation is available within the collections online, there has to be a focus indicator. So helping with the assistive technology in terms of determining like there's something here where you could do a keyboard interaction. All right, and then some of the final input modalities when we're thinking about operations, starting with like pointing. So pointing gestures, pointer gestures, typically through your mouse for more traditional use, but there are adaptive tools and technologies that use point specific, whether with an apparatus or thinking like one of the touch pins or tools, being able to do similar navigation and gestures. So for pointer gestures, most collections online navigation and functionality that are dictated by that point and click, being able to review if there is like gesture only functionality without a tap or click alternative. So wanting to make sure that if there's gestures for like somebody who's using like a tablet, for example, or their smartphone, that there can also be a tap or point and click option in addition to that particular gesture. So making sure there's more than one way to be able to access that material. And then similarly, pointer cancellation. So being able to, where the completion of the action isn't predicated on like the down event or the click of the particular pointer, and that it could be canceled or reversed if it happens. So having flexibility within that particular technology for a user using pointer technology to sort of back out or cancel whatever it is that they just did. Label, oops, sorry, I went back. Label in the name. So any sort of labels used in presentation, as we talked about with the landing pages and the section headers and labels, making sure the collections online is presented in a way that is readable, that is obvious to its particular purpose. If there's an image of text, making sure that is spelled out, and then there's accessible names and titles to go with those particular materials. And then motion actuation. So for this last operation requirement to think through, this particular one is functionality that supports the user motion, and that it must also then support a non-motion interface and or that motion can be disabled. So again, thinking through as with gestures, if there's some sort of motion actuation, which at the moment isn't super huge in our collections online, but is one that we want to make sure that we have a separate action available to people who are not able to do that particular motion actuation. All right, principle 3. So thinking about making things understandable, and that's really pertaining to delivering like easy to read content and access to museum collections content and assets. So making things available and appropriate for all of our audience members, but also making sure that they are accessible. So when thinking about understandable, first and foremost is needing to be able to easily obtain what sort of language the page is being presented in, or if there are separate language parts. And specifically, this is about human language. This is not about computer or coding language, but having the either human or assistive technologies being able to very quickly and easily determine what language am I viewing things in. We also want to think a bit about how to make things predictable, because that helps in our understanding, both for us as humans as well as assistive technologies. So thinking about on focus. So again, like the focus area and criteria we covered a little earlier. when there's an area in Collections Online and it's receiving focus, whether through like pointer or through like a keyboard shortcut, what have you, if it remains stationary and it's currently displayed, that it does not change in context than what it was initially presented in. So it's wanting to make sure that as a person is in a particular focus area, let's say it's they're viewing a particular image, that all of a sudden the background or scenery or context around or within how that image is being presented, that it does not change while it's being viewed. And then on input. So when users are providing input to the Collections Online interface, that there's no change of context here either, unless that is the expected behavior of whatever the particular person inputted into. An acceptable example of an expected change in context based on that user input is when a user interacts with the search area and that expects to be taken to a search results area where the search is executed. So that's the most obvious area for us in the Collections Online where user input should in fact change in terms of what's displayed because they've inputted data to then trigger search results. And then for us thinking about consistent navigation, so making things understandable in this area when we think of navigation, Collections Online should be consistent throughout, so predictable in terms of being able to navigate what we're expecting to see and where. When published by a proprietary collections management system, this is usually not an issue. However, because of customizations we can make, etc., it's always good to make sure we're reviewing flow through our particular Collections Online. Are things being, are navigation pathways being created in a way that is predictable and understandable to any sort of user? And especially if databases are homegrown or altered, I particularly recommend focusing on this area, especially as you go through the different accessibility requirements. All right, and then consistent identification. So again, we want to be predictable. Being predictable helps in understanding. So any sort of repeated elements within a Collections Online presentation, they should share identical functionality. So predictable in behavior. Similar, this should be reviewed when not using a proprietary CMS. So again, these things are usually covered as basic style, but should always be reviewed. And then finally, these last few items are more of like input assistance. So when people are using alternative inputs versus like a point and click mouse, we want to make sure that the behaviors that happen are predictable and interpreted accurately by different modalities. So first step, error identification. Any errors that happen to be triggered with the Collections Online should be identifiable and described to the user in text. That way, both human and any sort of assistive technology can take and interpret and then make it perceivable for what sort of error occurred. Similarly, labels or instructions. So when there is user input available, and for us, that is usually always within our search or advanced search areas, providing not just good labels, but even some user instruction for how they can interact with and use those areas helps to improve usability as well as accessibility. Error suggestion, and this is another excellent one for increased usability, is that whenever a user provides some sort of input and there's some sort of error, or it's for us, for like if our search doesn't execute properly, that there's some sort of helpful information provided as to why the error occurred and what they could do differently that may have a more successful result. So for us, when we're thinking about Collections Online, there could be some suggestions for how they could use the search perhaps more accurately, or maybe to make the search broader if they didn't get any results. And then error prevention. So this particular requirement is usually for legal and financial data type non-collections online things. It's good to be aware of the requirement, but it's not typically applicable for us. Moving us to the final principle. And this particular one focuses on robustness of the technology. So for us, it's to help ensure Collections Online, thinking website structure, navigation, functionality, that all of that can be correctly interpreted by a wide variety of users and the different assistive technologies that those users have, both present and future. So this is a big one in terms of not only being able to be used by different humans and their assistive technologies now, we need to make sure that whatever requirements we're meeting, whether through technical infrastructure or through softer text navigation design sort of approaches, that it can then be interpreted through any sort of future technology as well. And I will sort of asterisk here, this is partly why following an international standard like WCAG is such an important and good idea, since they are the international standard. How you implement the requirements as they've outlined means that any sort of assistive technologies will have a much better or higher percentage success rate of interacting with how you've implemented those requirements. So referring to and using international standards will help you be successful in this robustness long term. Well, short and long term. All right, getting into robustness, thinking about parsing. So this is on the more of the technical end. It's thinking about clean coding. So clean coding is the goal for the infrastructure that supports your collections online. And each of those elements should have a completed start and intake. So a lot of this falls under like good coding practices in general. We want to make sure that they're nested correctly so that they are interpreted and behave correctly, and that there's no duplicate attributes, IDs are unique, etc. These are some pretty fundamental coding things, as well as things that lend themselves naturally to how we produce and manage our data for collections online, but is an important aspect to understand technically as we think now and future oriented for accessibility. The next one, name, role, and value. So for forms like a reference request form, for example, links, components generated by a particular technical script, that they have names and roles that programmatically can be determined, so some non-human interpretation here of the values that could be set by the user. So additionally, changes to these items can be discernible and that it's available to visitors through that assistive technology. So again, being available to both human interpretation as well as assistive technology interpretation to help with human perception and intake. And then status messages. So any sort of status messages that are appearing, and this is in addition to those error messages we spoke of earlier, prompted within that collections area, should be programmatically discernible and presented to the user via the assistive technologies, and that's without having that message be in focus. So it's without the human or the assistive technology having to actually navigate to create that area of focus, that it is being presented even without that focus so that somebody can interact with it or perceive it through their assistive technologies, as usually status messages are time-wise important to receive at the time they pop up. So the resources for us to take a look at, and as you go off and learn more, first up, especially for organizations within the United States, there is a fact sheet, so sort of like a cliff notes of the Department of Justice ruling that any sort of state and federal agencies need to meet this particular requirement depending on size of the organization within like the next 2 to 3 years, I believe. So especially for those in the United States, especially those that are state or federal, and even for like the city municipal sizes, being familiar with this fact sheet and understanding the requirements coming up is critical for you to do now, especially if you need to do planning or some like retroactive corrections, etc., with your collections online content. If you'd like to learn more about like disability definition, inclusion strategies, the CDC.gov has some great resources available for inclusion in general, not just from the technology or website perspective. Similarly, Case Western Reserve University, they have a What is Accessibility webpage that goes into beyond it just providing access, like really thinking through some of the tenets of what can be truly accessible. And similarly, another resource, Hand Talk Accessibility, talking about what does it mean, what's the purpose, what are the types of accessibility, which does a great job going beyond just the what does it mean to be accessible and all of the different factors that we should consider, especially as we think about our community externally, but as well as our internal peers, colleagues, and their accessibility needs. And then for W3C, so that international standard that they've created, Much of their content is very freely available online. All of the different requirements that we went through and how they might apply to collections online, those requirements originated, of course, from their web accessibility initiative and the standards that they've created. So the citations for them are listed here. And there are so many resources there, including some educational webinars. So I recommend you go check those out. Even if you are not a technical person, there is quite a bit to gain as collection stewards, thinking through how we present collections online. So much great information here. So I recommend you check them out. And just continuation of some of the copyright notices, there's so much material they've provided, and therefore several different citations of their different resources that we've used and referenced in the creation of this webinar, as well as the related Lucidea Think Clearly blog posts. So we cover quite a bit together, reviewing American with Disabilities Act, the ADA, how disability is defined by the ADA to work with a similar definition for today's conversation. We then, of course, defined accessibility and the particular accessibility standards that we're referencing for today's webinar, but are also international standards that should be considered for everybody. And then, of course, how accessibility can relate to collections online and introducing those 4 accessibility principles. And then underneath each of those principles, the different types or areas of requirements for us to consider, again, referencing the Department of Justice ruling, where we're looking at the WCAG 2.1 AA versions of their standards. So all the content we've covered today is the content that is being required in the next couple of years by that Department of Justice ruling. And then, of course, we handed over accessibility resources because this has only scratched the surface in terms of providing an orientation to what the requirements look like and how they may be applicable to collections online. Before I let you go, new book available now. You can get your courtesy copy thanks to Lucidea Press. And for this particular book, it's Demystifying Data Preparation for a New CMS. And so this is for both technical and non-technical people. It's a very friendly version of thinking about our collections data, especially as we may be migrating into a new collections management system, and helps you think through what does data preparation mean, also gets into some data cleanup strategies. So please go check it out. And with that, I'll hand it back over to you, Bradley.
Thank you, Rachel, for the wonderful presentation. And to our audience, if you'd like to learn more about our museum collections management system called Argus, please feel free to visit our website or reach out to us at sales@lucidea.com, and we'd be happy to have a chat with you. And if you have any more questions on any of our software or our company, our contact details are on the screen, and please stay tuned for more webinars and content related to this series. On behalf of the Lucidea team, I thank you all for attending today, and until next time, thank you.